In a remote corner of the frontier, where the canyon ridges seem to scrape the belly of the sky and the wind carries the scent of sun-baked dust rather than rain, Corbin Thorne lived a life defined by the boundaries of his own silence. His ranch was situated in a shallow, wind-swept valley where the grass grew thin and stubborn, a 2-day ride from the nearest soul. He had chosen this isolation with a deliberate heart, seeking a place where no questions were asked and where a man could eventually forget the noise of the world he had left behind. He wasn't necessarily running from a crime, but rather from the suffocating expectations of people who claimed to know the path of righteousness while walking in shadows. On a particularly sweltering afternoon, as the heat shimmered off the rocky ground like liquid glass, Corbin walked toward his well to draw water for his horses. He didn't expect to find anything other than the rhythmic creak of the windlass, but instead, he saw a figure collapsed against the sun-bleached wooden fence. It was a young woman, taller than any person he had ever encountered, her limbs long and powerful even in her state of exhaustion. Her dark hair was a matted tangle of grit and dried blood, and her deerskin clothing was adorned with intricate beadwork that marked her clearly as Apache. Her lips were cracked white from the unrelenting thirst of the desert. Without hesitation, Corbin fetched a ladle of cool water from the bucket. When he offered it to her, she didn't reach for it with the desperate gratitude of a victim. Instead, she looked at him with obsidian eyes that held a sharp, piercing suspicion. She drank deeply, 3 times, her throat working with a rhythmic intensity. When she finished, she stood up, towering over him with a stature that was truly striking, perhaps reaching 6 feet or more. She stared at him for a long, silent minute as if she were memorizing the map of his soul. Then turned and vanished into the shimmering hills without uttering a single word. Corbin watched her go, convinced that this brief, strange encounter was merely a fleeting shadow in his solitary life. He went back to his chores, fixing a squeaking gate hinge and checking the rotting fence lines, but the image of the tall woman haunted his thoughts. He told himself it was just another traveler passing through, a prospector or a drifter, but the air felt different that evening. The horses in the corral were unusually restless, their hooves scraping the dirt in an anxious cadence, and the bay gelding let out a sharp, haunting whinny that cut through the stillness of the night. Corbin lay on his narrow cot, listening to the wind push against the cabin walls, unaware that the world he had built in isolation was about to be dismantled. The following morning, Corbin stepped out into the pale light of dawn, squinting against the rising sun. The valley was silent, but as his eyes adjusted to the glare, he realized he was not alone. At first, he thought the shapes on the ridge were mere shadows or rock formations, but shadows did not sit on horseback with such perfect, predatory stillness. He counted 10, then 20, and then he stopped counting as he realized that the entire ridge line was teeming with Apache warriors. They occupied the hills to the north, the slopes to the east, and the dry creek bed to the west. It was a living noose pulled tight around his home. Spears and rifles glinted in the early light. Corbin's hand moved toward the rifle leaning against his doorframe, but he checked the impulse immediately. One rifle against an army was a fool's errand. He stepped into the yard, his boots crunching on the hard-packed earth, and watched as the horses huddled against the far fence, sensing the overwhelming presence of danger. This was not a raid, raiders struck with the speed of a rattlesnake and disappeared. This was a deliberate, ceremonial surrounding, a message delivered in the language of numbers and silence. Movement caught his eye as a single rider broke away from the northern ridge and began a slow, controlled descent. The horse picked its way down the rocky slope with a precision that only came from a lifetime in the saddle. Corbin stood his ground, waiting to see if his luck had finally run dry. The rider stopped 50 feet away, an older man whose face was a testament to decades of sun, wind, and command. He wore no war paint, yet authority radiated from him like heat from a stone. Behind him, dozens more riders descended, flanking their leader. The silence was suffocating until the old warrior raised one hand, holding it there in a gesture that was neither a greeting nor an overt threat, but a demand for attention. Corbin's heart hammered against his ribs as he realized he was standing at the center of a judgment he didn't fully understand. The old warrior dismounted with a deliberate, almost ceremonial grace. He walked forward 10 paces and stopped, waiting for Corbin to meet the gesture. Corbin matched him, stepping forward until they were separated by only 50 feet of dusty ground. The warrior's face was weathered leather, his eyes black and unreadable. He carried no weapon in his hands, though a knife hung at his belt. Corbin kept his hands visible, offering no sign of aggression. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind and the distant cry of a hawk. Then, the old warrior pointed not at Corbin, but at the well. He made a gesture of pouring and drinking water. Corbin nodded, acknowledging the act of the previous day. The warrior called out a command in his own tongue, and the ranks of warriors on the eastern ridge parted to reveal a single rider. It was the woman from the well, but she was transformed. Her hair was braided with beads, and she wore clean deerskin decorated with silver and turquoise. She rode down the slope with an elegance that matched her father's, and as she approached, her immense height became even more apparent. She stopped 10 feet from Corbin and spoke in halting but clear English, stating that he had given water. She noted that he didn't know who she was when he helped her. Corbin replied simply that she was hurt and needed help. Surprised respect flickered in her eyes as she translated for her father. She explained that her father had sent her on a test of strength, to walk alone for 3 days without food or water, but she had fallen, injured her head, and lost her way. Corbin's act of giving water had saved her life. She told him her name was Nijoni, which meant beautiful, though she added that white men often joked about her height. Her father, the chief, had decided that Corbin was either a brave man or a fool, but because he helped a thirsty person without seeking a reward, he had earned a stay of execution. However, the test was not over. They would watch him to see if he was truly a good man or if he would betray their location to the white settlers. For the next 6 days, Corbin was a prisoner of observation. The warriors remained on the ridges, their campfire smoke rising into the evening sky like silent prayers. Corbin went about his work, repairing fences and drawing water, knowing that every movement was being weighed by 300 pairs of eyes. On the 4th day, he found a bundle of dried meat and a jar of water left by his door, a sign of provision or perhaps a way to ensure he lived long enough to finish their trial. By the 6th day, the psychological weight of being watched was beginning to erode his composure. Nijoni returned alone that morning, dismounting to speak with him. She stood nearly as tall as Corbin, her intelligent eyes scanning his ranch. She told him that most white men would have tried to run or would have sought a reward for helping a chief's daughter. Corbin admitted he was terrified but knew that running would only lead to a swifter death. Their conversation turned to the land. Nijoni spoke of how the white men built fences and dug wells on land that once belonged to everyone. Corbin felt the guilt of his legal title, a piece of paper signed by men who had never asked the Apache for permission. Suddenly, the crack of a distant gunshot shattered the morning air, followed by 2 more. Nijoni's posture stiffened as she signaled to her warriors. She warned Corbin that many white men with guns were approaching, militia hunters who were looking for Apache. She told him that if the settlers found him with the Apache, they would kill him. He told the militia there were 300 warriors on the ridges, a number that turned the bearded leader's face pale. The bravado of the 15 settlers evaporated as they realized they were vastly outnumbered on hostile ground. A high, piercing signal call echoed through the valley, answered from every ridge, signaling that the Apache were still present and surrounding them. Terrified, the militia mounted up and fled south, leaving Corbin alone once more in the dust of their retreat. Once the sound of the militia's hooves faded, Nijoni and her father descended from the ridges with their warriors. Nijoni approached Corbin, her expression softer now. She acknowledged that he had not betrayed them even when he could have earned the favor of his own people. He looked at Nijoni, who stood like a mountain, tall, unmovable, and beautiful, and understood that the water he had given her had started a fire of alliance that no fence or deed could ever contain. He realized that a human being is simply a human being, regardless of the papers men sign or the colors they wear, and he chose to accept the mark of the people who saw his soul rather than his skin.